Hello, fifth graders. All right, so we are going to be doing Unit 7, Lesson 3. But before that, here is the answers to Unit 7, Lessons 2, check understanding and vocabulary. So first of all, number 1, blank did not believe that land could be owned. That was Native Americans, which is A. Number 2, which animal provided Native Americans on the Great Plains with food, shelter, clothing, and tools? The answer is C, bison, not buffalo, but it says buffalo, so I guess you pick buffalo. Number 3, why were the Black Hills important to the Lakota? The answer is B, the area had religious meaning. Number 4, identify the effect settlers had on the Great Plains after moving on to Native American hunting grounds. First of all, settlers and railroad workers killed most of the bison, the buffalo. Also, there were conflicts with Native Americans over land, and Native Americans were eventually moved to reservations. So some combination of those things would be totally fine. If you only have one of them, that's okay. But just as long as you have some idea that, when settlers moved into this area, they destroyed Native Americans' way of life at the time. So they killed the bison, which is called a buffalo, but it's a bison. They fought with the Native Americans over land, and eventually the U.S. government moved Native Americans onto reservations, and the Native Americans who refused to move onto reservations were killed. It's pretty much how it went. Number 5, explain why the Black Hills area of South Dakota became a destination for settlers. So the big thing, of course, was that gold was discovered. It's kind of like California earlier. Someone was there, they were like, hey, oh my gosh, there's this shiny yellow rock, this is gold. And news got around very quickly, and people just rushed there to start digging in these mountains looking for gold. And so obviously the Native Americans did not appreciate that, but that is what it is. So gold was discovered in 1874. On the back page, the vocabulary, you just had 2, so it's probably super easy. Number 1 is property rights allow people to own land. That, of course, goes back to the fact that Native Americans, particularly in the plains, had no concept of property rights, but the settlers certainly did. And number 2, the pieces of land the U.S. government moved Native Americans to were called reservations. So that should get you through that. All right, so this is going to be Lesson 3 for Unit 7, which is called Big Business. Part A, World's Invention Capital. On New Year's Eve in 1879, crowds poured into Menlo Park, New Jersey. They packed the boardwalk outside the laboratory of inventor Thomas Edison to see the world's first electric lights. Edison's electric light proved something that most Americans already believed. The United States was the world's most modern country. In the late 1800s, elevators, telephones, and other inventions changed American life forever. Time of inventions. In the late 1800s, inventors were seen as heroes, similar to how explorers had been viewed in the past. Edison was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. He admitted, however, that his success had little to do with magic. For him, success came from hard work. He said, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." Edison and his assistants eventually developed more than 1,000 inventions. Besides the electric light, he made the first machine to record sound in 1877, which became the phonograph. He also made the first moving picture projector in 1896. In 1876, Edison worked around the clock to develop another invention, the telephone, but Alexander Graham Bell, a teacher of people who were deaf, invented it first. Bell's interest in communication led him to explore ways to send sound over electrical wires. Both Bell and Edison had help from a valuable assistant. Lewis Latimer, an African-American scientist, helped design the first telephone with Alexander Graham Bell. Later, working for Thomas Edison, Latimer developed a longer-lasting electric light bulb. Latimer's light bulb had a filament, the part that glows, made of carbon instead of paper. This made bulbs last longer and brought electric lighting into homes. So here's a picture of Latimer right there. So Thomas Edison is kind of an interesting guy, right? He's got lots and lots of inventions, but he was also a businessman, and depending on who you ask, not necessarily a super nice one. Generally, what happened is he used patents, so he would invent something and make a patent for it, and then he used that patent to stop other people from making anything even remotely like what he had made. But he basically spent a lot of time suing people to keep them from being able to essentially get in on the market that he had kind of cornered, and he did not want anybody to get in the way of his business. And then, of course, there's the whole thing with Tesla, which you can go online and see a million things about Thomas Edison and Tesla. These two guys pretty much hated each other. Tesla actually came and worked for Thomas Edison, and because of the way that Thomas Edison did business, they had a falling out, and yeah, so they really didn't like each other. Tesla came up with a way of, so Thomas Edison has these light bulbs, right? Well, you have to get power to the light bulbs to make them work, and Thomas Edison's idea was essentially to have a power plant just almost in every single neighborhood, basically. Whereas Tesla was one of the guys who came up with the idea of like a big power plant that could send out energy, and just different ways of doing it. I'm not going to get into the whole how the electric current travels, but basically they had two different ways of making that electricity get to homes, and Tesla's was arguably the better way, and was proven to be the better way. But Thomas Edison, in order to basically make people fear Tesla's idea of how to transfer electricity into homes, had an elephant and used Tesla's way of transferring electricity to electrocute an elephant in front of people, to show how dangerous it was, even though it was not. I mean, electricity is dangerous on itself, but the way that Tesla was doing it was not any more dangerous than the way Edison wanted to do it. But it was all PR stunts and ways to chop away at any success that Tesla was having. So on the one hand, Edison is brilliant, a hard worker, incredible inventor, that sort of thing. On the other hand, he was a ruthless businessman who was kind of a jerk. So, just is what it is. Anyway, kind of fun story. All right, part B, industries and workers. To reach American homes, these new inventions had to be made in large numbers, then shipped and sold. People established corporations, one of your vocabulary words, for this purpose. A corporation is a large company in which people invest money and share ownership. Two of the largest corporations were based on the building and transportation industries, steel and oil. So when you're talking about corporations, those are businesses that basically sell stocks. So people can buy a very, very, very tiny chunk of this business, a share in the business profits, and they put money in, and then they basically have like a sheet of paper. Now it's just an electronic thing, but a sheet of paper that says, hey, I own 0.0001% of this business, and then later they can sell that to, if the stock has gone up, they sell it and they get more money. If the stock has gone down, they sell it and they get less money. It's just kind of how it is. But the stock market, corporations that's what the stock market is dealing with a lot of times. Carnegie Steel Company. Andrew Carnegie came to the United States from Scotland at age 12 in 1848. By the time he was in his 30s, he owned steel plants in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Railroads used steel for tracks and cars. Steel was also used for bridges and skyscrapers. Carnegie plants made steel faster than those of his competitors. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Oil was an important industry long before it was used in cars as gasoline. In 1858, a miner struck oil in Pennsylvania. The black liquid was made into kerosene for lamps. Soon it greased the moving parts of industrial machines and railroad locomotives. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Company. He bought plants that turned crude oil into kerosene. He also purchased several railways and forced them to carry only his kerosene. By 1885, Rockefeller controlled the U.S. oil industry. Standard Oil, similar to Carnegie Steel, became a monopoly. That's another vocabulary word. A monopoly is a business that completely controls an industry, kind of like Thomas Edison with the movie theaters, though on a much smaller scale. Monopolies generally are on a very large scale, right? I mean, you can argue that anybody who invents a new thing initially has a monopoly on that because they're the only one who knows how to do it. But we don't really talk about that as a monopoly. What we talk about as a monopoly is if somebody gets a hold of something that is large and they basically control all of it. Doesn't mean that they control 100% of it, but they control 50, 60% of it, something like that. And that can be a problem because then they can drive up prices. They can do lots of other things that can be bad for people who are wanting to buy those products. Most Americans believe that the only way to have fair prices was for businesses to compete. While owners grew rich, workers struggled. Workers joined together. In 1900, the average laborer worked in a 60-hour. Workers joined together. In 1900, the average laborer worked a 60-hour week. Workers typically earned about $400 a year. A family of four needed at least $800 to survive. Working conditions were usually dirty and dangerous. Textile workers breathed air filled with tiny fibers that caused lung problems. Miners risked death from underground explosions, also from breathing in air that's got coal and things like that in it. That was also an issue. A factory in Connecticut had 16,000 accidents in 1 year. So, as these factories are coming together and as these businesses are getting bigger and bigger, the people at the very top are, businesses are always going to try to get as much money as they possibly can. That's just the nature of it. If a teacher is working, and so myself, if when St. Cecilia goes to hire me, if they say, hey, we'll pay you $50,000 a year, I'm not going to say, no, it's cool, just pay me $20,000 a year. That's not going to happen. You're always going to want the maximum amount that you can get because that's just how it is. It's you're working, and so you expect to be paid as much as you can for your work. Same thing with businesses. A business is always going to try to make the most money that it possibly can. Corporations in particular say, hey, well, we've got a duty to make as much money as possible because we have all these investors who invested in our company expecting it to make money and wanting it to make more money than when they invested in it, so that their stocks become more valuable, that sort of thing. And consequently, if you're not doing that, if you as a business say, hey, we only want to make 20% of what we actually could make, well, one, other companies are going to step in and they're going to make that extra amount of money, and two, your investors are not going to be very happy. They're going to start selling your stock, and it's not going to be worth as much, which means you will have less money to use. So I know corporations are painted as the bad guys, especially in this, and they totally are when they are intentionally forcing people to work dangerous jobs and not paying them very much money. But it's kind of like being angry at a tiger for eating other animals. Like it's just what it does, right? Like businesses are going to try to make money, and they're going to try and make as much money as possible. And this is where eventually we're going to find that like the federal government is stepping in and saying like, okay, we got to rein this in. Yes, make as much money as you can, but there's rules that you have to follow. And in a time where there are no rules, that's they're going to do what they're going to do. If the deer don't run away, the wolf is going to eat as many deer as it can until it's full, and then as soon as it's hungry again, it's going to eat more deer if they just stand around, right? So you have rules in nature where, hey, the prey runs away and the hunter has to catch them. That kind of keeps the hunter from being able to just eat an entire herd of deer. Same idea here. Anyway, workers wanted better conditions, but they had little power when they acted alone. To protect themselves, workers formed labor unions, another one of your vocabulary words. Labor unions are groups that represented workers. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was founded by Samuel Gompers. The AFL represented many unions. Its leaders pushed for higher pay for all workers, workplace safety, and an 8-hour workday. Industries that refused union demands could face a strike. This is another vocabulary word. A strike is when workers refuse to work. Now, strikes are kind of interesting because workers refuse to work, but that means that they also aren't getting paid. So there's always kind of this balance between, how long can the strike go on before these people can't they still have to eat, they still have to buy food, things like that. So strikes can be kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Like, yeah, you're hurting the people, the factory, the corporation, whatever that you're striking against, but you're also being hurt on the flip side. Now, nowadays, and actually back then too, what would happen is you have these unions, which you, by the way, have to pay money to be a part of, at least today anyway. And the unions kind of would have these funds built up so that if their workers went on strike, they could give everybody a little bit of money to kind of help them, sustain the strike longer and hopefully get to the point where the corporation or the industry says, we can't sustain this, we have to give in at least to some of the demands. And usually there's a little bit of a like give and take, you have to compromise when people are striking and they refuse to compromise and the business says we can't meet your demands, then bad things are going to start happening. Anyway, so a strike could cost an industry millions of dollars. Employers often used violence against strikers for that reason. They also tried to stop people from joining unions because they were worried about this sort of thing happening. So it was in the best interest of the employer, well, maybe not, but they thought it was in their best interest to make sure that their employees were not members of unions because they saw unions as a dangerous thing. Now, all of a sudden, the employees are getting these ideas that they should be paid more and that if they aren't being paid more, they're just going to refuse to work, that sort of thing. So, especially early on, and later, the United States makes laws that say, hey, you have to let people unionize if they want to. Early on, they tried to keep people from ever forming unions, and if they found out that people were forming unions, then they would, start firing people that were thought to be in the union. So it was potentially pretty bad. In 1892, a strike at Carnegie's Homestead steel plant caused a gun battle between workers and security men. It killed 10 people. Labor unions won small battles in the 1800s. During this time, most workers had little power against large corporations. Okay, so that's the end of lesson 3. It's a pretty short one, so just 2 sections, A and B there. On your packet for Unit 7, Lesson 3, question number 5 is going to be kind of a weird one. It's explain why some people thought inventors were heroes. This was not really covered, other than the fact that it said that people thought that inventors were heroes, right? So in the late 1800s, inventors were seen as heroes, similar to how explorers had been viewed in the past. And that's all it says about it. So for this question, basically talk about the fact that people's lives are being improved by the creations of these inventors. That's really what it's looking for, even though it is kind of weird to ask you a question about something that there was literally one sentence about and then no other information. But that's what they're looking for, is basically just talk about the fact that inventors were creating things that improved people's lives. A lot of the things that you and I take for granted today, either the building blocks for them or the invention themselves are made here in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Things like the light bulb that you turn on every single day, and you might not think about the fact that thing, someone had to invent it, and it happened 120, 130 years ago, however many years. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and have a good day.